Welcome, everyone. Picture this. You're standing on a street in the city of Nogales. On one side of you, there are well-maintained roads, prosperous businesses, and people living comfortable lives with access to quality healthcare and education. Walk just 100 feet in the other direction, cross a fence, and suddenly you're in a completely different world where incomes are much lower, infrastructure is crumbling, and opportunities are scarce. Here's the fascinating part. This isn't two different cities. It's the same city, just divided by the US-Mexico border. Same geography, same climate, people with shared cultural heritage. So, why is one side thriving while the other struggles? This question gets even more mind-blowing when we zoom out globally. Today, the richest 20% of countries are about 30 times wealthier than the poorest 20%. That's not a typo, 30 times richer. For decades, economists have been trying to solve this puzzle. Is it natural resources, geography, culture, intelligence? Well, in 2024, three brilliant economists, Daron Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James Robinson, won the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for finally cracking this code. And their answer will completely change how you think about success, failure, and why some nations flourish while others remain trapped in poverty. Spoiler alert, it's not what most people think. Over the next hour, we're going to dive deep into their revolutionary research. No economics degree required, I promise, to break down every concept using real-world examples and simple analogies that anyone can understand. By the end of this video, you'll have powerful insights into one of humanity's biggest questions. Why do some societies prosper while others don't? So grab your favorite beverage, get comfortable, and let's explore the ideas that just won the most prestigious prize in economics.
Before we dive into their groundbreaking research, let's get to know the brilliant minds behind these discoveries. These aren't just ivory tower academics. They're individuals whose personal journeys shaped their understanding of global inequality. Daron Acemoglu, the Turkish-American pioneer. Meet Daron Acemoglu, a name that might be tricky to pronounce, but whose ideas are reshaping economics. Born in Turkey in 1967, Acemoglu's path to Nobel Prize glory wasn't straightforward. He left Turkey for England, earning his economics degree at the University of York, then his PhD at the London School of Economics in 1992. But here's what makes his story fascinating. As someone who grew up witnessing Turkey's complex relationship between democracy and economic development, Acemoglu had a front-row seat to see how political institutions can either boost or crush a nation's potential. Since 1993, he's been at MIT, where he's become what they call an institute professor. That's like academic royalty, reserved for only the most distinguished scholars. He's authored over 120 peer-reviewed papers and has mentored over 60 PhD students. But beyond the impressive credentials, Acemoglu brings a unique perspective from someone who's lived between worlds, understanding both developing and developed economies from the inside. Simon Johnson, from England to global economic leadership. Simon's story is equally compelling. Born in England, he studied at Oxford and Manchester before getting his PhD from MIT in 1989. But here's where his story gets really interesting. From 2007 to 2008, during one of the most turbulent periods in modern economic history, Johnson served as the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund. Think about that timing. He was in charge of economic analysis at the IMF right when the 2008 financial crisis hit. This wasn't theoretical modeling. He was dealing with real countries facing real economic collapse. This experience gave him incredible insights into how institutions either protect or destroy prosperity during crisis moments. Johnson has a special talent for translating complex economic ideas into language that policymakers and the public can understand. His books like 13 Bankers helped millions of people understand what really caused the financial crisis. James Robinson completes this dream team. While Acemoglu and Johnson are based at MIT, Robinson brings a political science perspective from the University of Chicago. His background combines economics with deep political analysis, crucial for understanding how power structures shape economic outcomes. What makes this trio special isn't just their individual brilliance, but how their different perspectives created something greater than the sum of its parts. Acemoglu brings mathematical rigor and theoretical innovation. Johnson contributes real-world policy experience and crisis management insights. Robinson adds political science depth and historical analysis. Together, they didn't just study economics, they studied power. They asked the uncomfortable questions about why some people get rich while others stay poor, and they had the courage to challenge conventional wisdom with hard data and historical evidence. Now, let's explore the revolutionary ideas that earned them the world's most prestigious economic prize.
Imagine you're an alien visiting Earth for the first time, and you're trying to understand human civilization. You'd probably be puzzled by what you see. Why does someone born in Switzerland have a life expectancy of 83 years and an average income of $80,000, while someone born in Chad can expect to live only 54 years with an income of less than $700? For centuries, people have tried to answer this question with various theories. The geography theory. Maybe it's the climate. Perhaps tropical countries are too hot for productive work, while temperate zones are perfect for agriculture and industry. Or maybe it's natural resources. Countries with oil, diamonds, or fertile soil should be rich, right? But wait, Singapore is tropical and has virtually no natural resources, yet it's incredibly wealthy. Meanwhile, the Democratic Republic of Congo has some of the world's richest mineral deposits, vast forests, and fertile land, but remains desperately poor. The culture theory. Okay, maybe it's cultural values. Perhaps some cultures have stronger work ethics, better family structures, or traditions that promote saving and investment. Again, this doesn't hold up. South Korea and North Korea share the same culture, the same history, even the same families separated by a border. Yet one is a prosperous democracy, the other an impoverished dictatorship. The education and skills theory. What about education? Surely countries that invest more in schooling and skills should be richer. This is closer to the truth, but it's still not the full answer. Many countries have tried to boost education without seeing economic growth. Meanwhile, some nations grew rapidly before achieving high literacy rates. So, what's the real answer? Our Nobel laureates spent decades analyzing data from hundreds of countries across centuries of history, and they discovered something that completely changes how we think about prosperity and poverty. The answer is institutions. Not geography, not culture, not natural resources, or even education levels, although those can matter. The primary factor that determines whether a nation prospers or remains poor is the quality of its institutions. Now, when economists say institutions, they don't just mean organizations like banks or schools. They mean the rules of the game, the formal and informal constraints that shape how people interact, make decisions, and organize society. Think of institutions like the rules of a sport. In a well-refereed soccer game with clear, fair rules that everyone follows, players can focus on playing their best. But imagine a game where the referee is corrupt. The rules change randomly, and some players get special advantages. You'd end up with chaos instead of beautiful soccer. That's exactly what happens with countries. Nations with good institutions, fair laws, property rights, accountable government, rule of law, create an environment where people can innovate, invest, and prosper. Countries with bad institutions, corruption, arbitrary rules, elite capture, trap their citizens in poverty no matter how hard they work. But here's the really groundbreaking part of their research. They proved this wasn't just a theory. Using incredibly clever research methods that we'll explore next,
Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson demonstrated that institutions are the fundamental cause of long-run prosperity. And the story of how they proved this is one of the most brilliant pieces of detective work in the history of economics.
Now, here's where our Nobel laureates faced a massive challenge. Every economics student learns early on that correlation doesn't equal causation. Just because rich countries tend to have better institutions doesn't prove that good institutions cause prosperity. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe rich countries can afford better institutions. This is like trying to figure out whether exercise makes people healthy or whether healthy people are just more likely to exercise. How do you separate cause from effect? The ingenious solution: historical natural experiments. In a perfect world, economists would run controlled experiments, take two identical countries, give one good institutions and the other bad institutions, then see what happens over 300 years. Obviously, that's impossible. But our laureates realized that history had already run these experiments for us. European colonization created what economists call natural experiments. Situations where similar societies ended up with dramatically different institutions for reasons that were essentially random. The settler mortality insight, a stroke of genius. Now here's where their research gets absolutely brilliant. When Europeans colonized different parts of the world starting in the 1500s, they faced vastly different disease environments. In some places, like temperate North America or Australia, European settlers could survive and thrive. But in tropical areas like sub-Saharan Africa or parts of South America, diseases like malaria, yellow fever, and dysentery killed European settlers at horrific rates. In some African colonies, the annual death rate for European settlers was over 500 per 1,000, meaning most Europeans died within 2 years of arrival. Now, here's the key insight. This difference in death rates was determined by germs and geography, factors completely unrelated to the economic potential of these regions. But it had enormous consequences for the types of institutions Europeans created. Two paths of colonization. Path 1. Low settler mortality. Settlement colonies. In places where Europeans could survive, they came to stay. They brought their families, built communities, and created institutions to protect themselves. Property rights, representative government, rule of law, courts that worked fairly. Why? Because they planned to live there permanently and wanted good institutions for themselves and their children. Path 2. High settler mortality. Extractive colonies. In places where Europeans died quickly, they didn't come to build societies. Instead, they created what our laureates call extractive institutions. Systems designed to pull out as much wealth as quickly as possible with minimal European presence. They ruled through local strongmen, created monopolies, forced labor systems, and built institutions that concentrated power and wealth in the hands of a tiny elite. Now comes the methodological brilliance. The researchers realized they could use historical settler mortality rates as what economists call an instrumental variable. Since settler mortality was determined by germs and climate, factors unrelated to a region's economic potential, it provided a randomized way to study institutional effects. They collected data on historical European settler mortality rates across colonies, the types of institutions created in each colony, and modern economic outcomes in these same regions. The results were stunning and clear. Regions where settler mortality was low developed inclusive institutions and are prosperous today. Regions where settler mortality was high got extractive institutions and remain poor today, even centuries later.
The Nogales example revisited. Remember our Nogales example from the beginning? This research explains it perfectly. The American side inherited Anglo-settler institutions, property rights, rule of law, representative democracy. The Mexican side inherited Spanish colonial institutions, concentration of power, weaker property rights, less accountable government. Same geography, same people, same climate, same culture, but completely different institutional legacies from colonization, leading to completely different outcomes today. The reversal of fortune. Perhaps their most striking finding is what they call the reversal of fortune. The regions that were richest before European colonization, like the Aztec and Inca empires, are often the poorest today. Meanwhile, areas that were sparsely populated and poor 500 years ago, like North America and Australia, are now among the world's wealthiest regions. This completely destroys theories based on geography, climate, or natural advantages. The difference? Institutional legacies from the colonial period. But understanding the research methods is just the beginning. Now let's explore the two types of institutions they identified and why this distinction is absolutely crucial for understanding our modern world.
Now we come to the heart of their Nobel Prize-winning insight, the fundamental distinction between inclusive and extractive institutions. This isn't just academic theory. Understanding this difference gives you a powerful lens for analyzing any society, from your local community to entire nations. Inclusive institutions, the foundation of prosperity. Inclusive institutions are systems that encourage broad participation in economic and political life. Think of them as institutions that spread power and opportunity widely, rather than concentrating them in the hands of a few. Let's break down what makes institutions inclusive. 1. Secure property rights for everyone. In societies with inclusive institutions, regular people can own property and feel confident it won't be taken away arbitrarily. This might seem basic, but it's revolutionary. When a farmer knows she owns her land, she'll invest in irrigation and better seeds. When a small business owner knows his shop is secure, he'll expand and hire workers. 2. Rule of law that applies to everyone. In inclusive systems, the law applies equally to rich and poor, powerful and weak. Contracts are enforced, courts are relatively fair, and even powerful people can't ignore legal rules. This creates predictability, the foundation for long-term investment and planning. Think about starting a business. Would you invest your savings in a country where a powerful politician could shut you down on a whim? Of course not. But if you trust that fair courts will protect your rights, you're much more likely to take entrepreneurial risks. Real-world examples of inclusive institutions. The United States, despite its flaws, constitutional protections, competitive markets, rule of law, democratic participation, these inclusive institutions enabled waves of immigration, innovation, and economic growth. South Korea's transformation. After decades of military dictatorship, South Korea transitioned to democracy in the 1980s, creating more inclusive institutions. The result? Rapid economic growth and the rise of global companies like Samsung and Hyundai. Botswana's success. Unlike many African nations, Botswana built relatively inclusive institutions after independence, becoming one of Africa's most prosperous and stable countries. Extractive institutions, the poverty trap. Now let's examine the opposite, extractive institutions. These are systems designed to concentrate power and resources in the hands of a small elite while limiting opportunities for the broader population. Key features of extractive institutions: concentrated property rights. Land, businesses, and resources are controlled by a small elite. Most people have no secure ownership and thus no incentive to invest or improve their situation. Arbitrary rule of law. Laws exist mainly to protect the elite and extract resources from everyone else.
Courts favor the powerful, contracts aren't reliably enforced, and legal outcomes depend on who you know rather than what the law says. Limited political participation. Political power is concentrated in the hands of a small group, whether it's a dictator, a military junta, or an oligarchy. Regular citizens have little meaningful influence over decisions that affect their lives. Economic monopolies and barriers. The economy is dominated by monopolies, often state-controlled or connected to political elites. New businesses face enormous barriers, innovation is suppressed, and economic activity serves the elite rather than broader prosperity. Real-world examples of extractive institutions. Colonial Latin America. Spanish colonial institutions concentrated land in massive haciendas, used forced labor systems, and created rigid social hierarchies that persisted for centuries. The Soviet Union. Despite ideological claims about equality, the Soviet system created extractive institutions where the Communist Party elite controlled all resources while limiting opportunities for ordinary citizens. Zimbabwe under Mugabe. What started as a promising newly independent nation descended into extractive institutions as Mugabe concentrated power, seized property arbitrarily, and destroyed the rule of law. North Korea today, perhaps the most extreme modern example. A tiny elite controls all resources while the population faces severe restrictions on economic and political participation. The commitment problem. Why change is so difficult. Here's where our laureates made another crucial discovery. Understanding why extractive institutions persist even when everyone would be better off with inclusive ones. They identified what's called the commitment problem. Imagine you're a dictator in a poor country. Your advisors tell you that introducing property rights, rule of law, and democracy would make the country much richer. So rich that even your share of a larger pie would be bigger than your current total control of a small pie. So, why don't you reform? The commitment problem. Once you give up control, you can't credibly promise that you'll still get your share of the larger pie. Future leaders might punish you, redistribute your wealth, or even prosecute you for past actions. This creates a trap. Elites know that inclusive institutions would create more prosperity, but they can't credibly commit to benefiting from that prosperity once they give up power. So they stick with extractive institutions that keep them in control, even though it keeps everyone poor. Breaking the trap, threats and revolutions. But the laureates also discovered how societies sometimes escape this trap. When elites face credible threats, popular uprisings, economic collapse, international pressure, they may choose to introduce inclusive reforms rather than risk losing everything. The key insight: democratization often happens not because elites become enlightened, but because they face threats that make reform preferable to revolution. This explains waves of democratization throughout history, from 19th century suffrage movements to post-Cold War transitions to the Arab Spring, although many of those failed to establish lasting inclusive institutions. Understanding inclusive versus extractive institutions gives us a powerful framework for analyzing why societies succeed or fail. But how does this translate into practical impacts on real people's lives? That's what we'll explore next.
Now that we understand the theory, let's explore how these Nobel Prize-winning insights translate into real-world impacts. This isn't just academic knowledge gathering dust in journals. These ideas are actively shaping policy decisions, investment strategies, and development programs around the world. Development aid, a fundamental rethinking. For decades, international development aid focused on building schools, hospitals, and roads, what economists call physical capital. The thinking was simple. Poor countries lack infrastructure, so let's build infrastructure and they'll become rich. These efforts were well-intentioned and sometimes helpful, but the results were often disappointing. Countries received billions in aid, got new buildings and equipment, but remained poor. Why?
Because without inclusive institutions, new infrastructure often got captured by elites, fell into disrepair, or failed to generate broader prosperity. The Acemoglu-Johnson-Robinson framework revolutionized development thinking. Instead of just building things, successful development requires building institutions, rule of law, property rights, accountable governance, competitive markets. Modern aid approaches influenced by their research. 1. Governance conditionality. Major development organizations now tie aid to governance reforms. Countries receiving assistance must demonstrate progress on rule of law, transparency, and accountable institutions. 2. Anti-corruption focus. Development programs increasingly focus on fighting corruption not just because it's morally wrong, but because extractive institutions make development aid ineffective. 3. Private sector development. Rather than just government-to-government transfers, aid increasingly supports inclusive economic institutions that enable private sector growth and entrepreneurship. Investment and business strategy. The laureate's research has become essential for international business and investment decisions. Companies now systematically evaluate institutional quality when making location decisions. Think about it from a CEO's perspective. Would you build a factory in a country where property rights are weak? Would you invest in research and development where intellectual property isn't protected? Would you create jobs where labor laws change arbitrarily? Practical applications. 1. Country risk assessment. Investment firms use institutional quality measures, rule of law indices, property rights protection, governance scores as key factors in country risk analysis. 2. ESG investing. The growing ESG investment movement heavily incorporates institutional analysis. Investors increasingly recognize that good governance isn't just ethically right, it's financially smart. 3. Supply chain decisions. Companies consider institutional factors when designing supply chains. A country might have low labor costs, but if institutions are extractive, it poses long-term risks to business operations. Policy reform in developing countries. Perhaps most importantly, the laureate's research provides a roadmap for countries seeking to escape poverty through institutional reform. Success stories influenced by these insights. Rwanda's institutional transformation. After the 1994 genocide, Rwanda focused intensively on building inclusive institutions, rule of law, property rights, anti-corruption measures, business-friendly policies. The result has been remarkable economic growth and stability. Georgia's Rose Revolution reforms. Following the 2003 Rose Revolution, Georgia implemented comprehensive institutional reforms, fighting corruption, strengthening rule of law, improving government accountability. Economic growth followed institutional improvement. Estonia's digital government. Estonia built highly inclusive digital institutions, transparent, accessible, efficient government services that treat all citizens equally. This institutional innovation supported rapid economic development. Understanding democratic backsliding. The laureate's framework also helps us understand concerning trends in established democracies. When institutions become more extractive, when rule of law weakens, when political participation becomes less meaningful, when economic competition decreases, prosperity is at risk. Warning signs their research identifies: erosion of judicial independence, weakening of property rights, reduced press freedom, increased barriers to political participation, growing economic concentration among elites. Technology and institutional change. Their insights are also relevant for understanding how technology affects institutions. Digital platforms can either promote inclusion by expanding access to markets and information, or extraction by concentrating power in the hands of tech monopolies.
Consider social media platforms. Do they create inclusive institutions by giving everyone a voice, or extractive ones by concentrating power over information in a few companies? The laureate's framework suggests the answer depends on governance structures, competition policies, and accountability mechanisms. Climate change and institutional quality. Even climate change responses connect to institutional quality. Countries with inclusive institutions are better at implementing effective climate policies because leaders are accountable to citizens who bear climate costs. Rule of law enables enforcement of environmental regulations. Competitive markets reward clean innovation. Property rights create incentives for sustainable resource management. The beauty of the Acemoglu-Johnson-Robinson framework is its universality. Whether we're talking about economic development, business strategy, technological governance, or climate policy, the quality of institutions, whether they're inclusive or extractive, fundamentally shapes outcomes.
As we wrap up our deep dive into the 2024 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, let's step back and appreciate the magnitude of what Daron Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James Robinson have accomplished. They didn't just win a prestigious award. They fundamentally changed how we understand one of humanity's most pressing questions. Why do some societies prosper while others remain trapped in poverty? The Revolutionary Insights Recap. 1. Institutions are the fundamental cause of prosperity. Geography, culture, and natural resources all matter, but the primary driver of long-term prosperity is the quality of a society's institutions, the rules of the game that shape how people interact and organize themselves. 2. The inclusive versus extractive framework. Societies prosper when they build inclusive institutions that spread opportunity widely. They stagnate when they're trapped by extractive institutions that concentrate power and wealth among a small elite. 3. Historical origins have lasting effects. The institutional legacies of colonialism continue to shape global inequality today. Understanding this history helps us understand why some former colonies prospered while others remained poor. 4. The commitment problem explains institutional persistence. Extractive institutions persist not because elites are evil, but because they face a credible commitment problem. They can't guarantee they'll benefit from reforms that reduce their power. 5. Change is possible through strategic pressure. Societies can escape institutional traps when elites face credible threats that make reform preferable to revolution or collapse. Why this matters for everyone? You might be thinking, this is fascinating, but I'm not running a country or making billion-dollar investment decisions. How does this affect my daily life? Here's the truth. These insights matter for everyone because we all live within institutional frameworks that shape our opportunities and outcomes. At the personal level, your career prospects depend partly on whether your country has inclusive economic institutions that reward merit and innovation. Your ability to start a business depends on property rights, rule of law, and competitive markets. Your political voice depends on inclusive democratic institutions. Even your local community's prosperity depends on the quality of local institutions. As citizens, understanding these insights makes you a more informed voter and civic participant. You can better evaluate policies and politicians based on whether they strengthen inclusive institutions or create extractive ones. As global citizens, this knowledge helps you understand international development, foreign policy, and global inequality in more sophisticated ways. The optimistic message. While the laureate's research explains persistent global inequality, it also offers hope. Institutions can change. Countries can escape poverty traps. Societies can build more inclusive systems. We've seen this happen repeatedly throughout history. Post-war Japan and Germany built inclusive institutions and achieved remarkable prosperity.
South Korea transitioned from military dictatorship to democracy and became an economic powerhouse. Countries like Botswana, Estonia, and Rwanda have shown that institutional transformation is possible even after devastating setbacks. But the research also warns us that progress isn't automatic or irreversible. Even countries with long histories of inclusive institutions can slide towards extractive ones if citizens aren't vigilant. The commitment problem works both ways. Just as elites in extractive systems struggle to credibly commit to reform, elites in inclusive systems may be tempted to concentrate power if they face insufficient checks and balances. Your role in this story. So what can you do with this knowledge? Stay informed. Keep learning about institutional quality in your own country and around the world. Support journalism and research that hold institutions accountable. Participate. Engage in democratic processes. Vote. Volunteer. Join civic organizations. Inclusive institutions require active participation to remain inclusive. Support global development. When supporting international charities or development programs, prioritize those that focus on building inclusive institutions rather than just providing temporary aid. 4. Think institutionally. Whether you're in business, education, nonprofits, or any other field, consider how your decisions affect institutional quality. Do your actions strengthen inclusive systems or create extractive ones? Share these ideas. Help others understand these concepts. The more people who understand the importance of inclusive institutions, the more likely we are to build and maintain them. Final thoughts. The 2024 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences recognizes more than brilliant academic research. It honors insights that can help us build a more prosperous and equal world. Akamoglu, Johnson, and Robinson have given us a roadmap for understanding why societies succeed or fail, and more importantly, how we can do better. Their work reminds us that prosperity isn't destiny. It's not determined by geography, culture, or natural endowments. It's determined by the institutions we choose to build and maintain. That's a tremendous responsibility and an incredible opportunity. We have the knowledge to build more inclusive societies. The question is whether we have the wisdom and courage to act on it. If this video helped you understand these crucial ideas, please like it and subscribe to the channel. Share it with friends, family, and colleagues who would benefit from understanding how institutions shape our world. In the comments, let me know. What examples of inclusive or extractive institutions do you see in your own community or country? How do you think we can strengthen inclusive institutions where you live? Thanks for joining me on this intellectual journey. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep working to build the inclusive institutions that can create prosperity for everyone.